an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, after very public divisions on shoot to kill and defence policy, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has a new row to manage tonight. He's appointed the former London Mayor Ken Livingstone to help run the party's defence review, and some of his MPs are far from happy about it. One of them, Kevan Jones, who also happens to be Shadow Defence Minister, had a few choice words about the appointment, only to find himself accused by Mr Livingstone of needing psychiatric help. Mr Jones has spoken publicly in the past about his battle with depression. Mr Livingstone later apologised unreservedly. In a minute, I'll speak to Mr Livingstone, who's in North London, to Mr Jones and to Lord Richards, the former head of the Armed Forces, about that and Labour's defence policy. But first, here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
40 years ago, Jeremy and I were here...
Ken Livingstone is one of Jeremy Corbyn's oldest political allies. No surprise, perhaps, that the Labour leader wanted him to be co-convener, as the party calls it, of a review on Britain's nuclear deterrent. But pro-Trident Maria Eagle had been told she was sole chair. The first the Shadow Defence Secretary heard of the anti-Trident Ken Livingstone sharing the job was on Twitter. Her deputy defence spokesman, Kevan Jones, said Ken Livingstone didn't know much about defence and could damage Labour's credibility on the issue. Ken Livingstone bit back. I think Kevan Jones might need some psychiatric help. He's obviously very depressed and disturbed. He should pop off and see his GP before he makes these offensive comments.
Now,
it's 3 years since Kevan Jones spoke in the Commons about his past experience of severe depression. Ken Livingstone, though, refused to apologise.
He's got no right to criticise someone because he just doesn't like them.
He criticised you, yes, but you've been offensive to him. You said he needs to go and get psychiatric help from his GP.
I just grew up working class boy in South London. If someone's rude to you, you're rude back to them, and he needs to get used to it.
Ken Livingstone refused to apologise until Jeremy Corbyn himself phoned him up, and then he tweeted this. I unreservedly apologise to Kevan Jones for my comments. They should not have been made at all, let alone in this context.
The comments were disgraceful, massively disappointing for someone with that level of experience, and having an apology apparently extracted out of him. But I think more to the point, you know, if Ken Livingstone is wanting to take on this role, which clearly he is, he needs to do it in a comradely and constructive fashion, and you know, that wasn't the impression that we've had so far.
I sang the Marseillaise in French.
This comes after Jeremy Corbyn at Wembley last night has been criticised by his own MPs for his comments on whether Jihadi John should have been killed, and raising questions about police shoot-to-kill procedures. In the Commons today, the Labour leader defended police budgets.
Will he be able to tell us whether or not this community policing and other police budgets are protected or not in next week's autumn statement?
As well as wanting resources, the police want the appropriate powers. And hasn't it come to something when the leader of Her Majesty's opposition thinks that the police, when confronted by a Kalashnikov-waving terrorist, isn't sure what the reaction should be?
One Shadow Cabinet member said, after years in the past of crawling back and trying to rescue its reputation for running the economy, the party under Jeremy Corbyn now risked plummeting even lower and losing its reputation on national security, the very foundation of electoral success. The Shadow Cabinet member said Jeremy Corbyn may have to go a lot earlier than people think. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News, Westminster.
Well, Ken Livingstone joins us now from North London, and with me in the studio are Labour's Shadow Defence Minister, Kevan Jones, and the former Chief of Defence Staff, Lord Richards. Kevan Jones, we'll deal with Labour and Syria in a minute, but let's just sort out this row first. Do you accept Mr Livingstone's apology?
Well, the fact of the matter is we made great strides in this country about tackling stigma, and I've been part of that. Jeremy Corbyn, fair to himself, has worked very hard on this agenda. And I think it's sad that in this day and age that somehow has passed Ken Livingstone by, that he can actually use such inflammatory language, which is not just an insult to me, and I've got broad shoulders. But what I feel sorry for are the millions of people out there who are struggling with mental illness, who will just see his comments as both backward-looking and also offensive.
Do you agree with your colleague, the Shadow Mental Health Minister, who says that this should be treated as seriously as sexism or racism?
Well, the fact of the matter is that, as I say, we've worked very hard, both as a Labour Party and also charities. And Jeremy's been at the forefront of that. I've worked very closely with him on mental health issues. And I think for Ken Livingstone to use this language and not apologise until he's forced to by Jeremy Corbyn, I think just, puts back that agenda. And anything that does that is not helpful.
Ken Livingstone, you had 2 opportunities to apologise, and you were forced to do so, weren't you?
No, Jeremy phoned and said actually he's quite a decent guy, and reminded me that Jeremy's strategy is that we don't do all the offensive backstabbing and rows that we've had in the past, so I just got on board with that. If I've upset anyone, I'm really sorry. But this row isn't something I started. It's because I was attacked as not fit for this job. And you could just have picked up the phone and asked me, and I'd have reminded you for 5 years, as leader of the GLC, we were responsible for civil defence in London. And for the 4 years after 9/11, we worked both with the military and the police to prepare for the attack on London. The idea I have no involvement or understanding of the military actions and their consequences is really quite offensive.
Well, let me put that to Kevin Jones. You started it, he's saying.
Well, the fact of the matter is that neither myself or Maria Eagle even knew that Mr Livingstone had been appointed this morning. The fact of the matter is, as well, that doesn't excuse the offensive language he used in reply, which has done a huge damage to, I think, the debate that we have in the UK about mental health and the good work that both Labour Party, Jeremy, myself and the charity sector have done trying to address stigma. And I'm sorry, the idea that he came to apologise, no, he didn't. As I spoke to Jeremy at lunchtime, he rang him, and it was only after he rang him that he actually apologised.
Can you work together on Labour's defence policy now?
Well, the fact of the matter is I'm not sure what Mr Livingstone's role is, because he talks about the role he played as mayor, which is fine. But I would have thought if he had that, an interaction with charities in his own constituency, for example, in London, he would have actually recognised that using the language he did about mental health is totally inappropriate in this day and age.
So does he have to go, Ken Livingstone?
Well, I've got to say, in terms of some of the languages used, it's caused huge offence to people, not just in the Labour Party, in the charity sector and others. And I think there's no place for that type of language in this modern era.
So does he have to quit this new defence role?
Well, I'm not sure what his role. I'm not sure what his role is. But the fact of the matter is,
co-chair of the Labour Party Defence.
It was news to both myself and Maria this morning when he announced it on Twitter last night.
Mr Livingstone.
I mean, Jeremy, if I can actually say to you, you provoked this row, you questioned my ability to do this job. Why didn't you just pick up the phone and ask me what I knew and understood about it? I've been debating military and defence issues for 45 years in both our party and in the media.
Well, what I say, why announce something on Twitter last night, which you did, and then use grossly offensive language to myself and millions of other sufferers of mental health in this country to get over your point? I'm sorry. And then you say somehow excuse it because of your background and accuse it that somehow other people had posh educations, which I did not, I can remind you. That doesn't excuse what you've done. You were forced to apologise. You were not going to apologise until Jeremy told you to.
No.
And you said it was because you grew up in South London that if someone's rude to you, you're rude back to them.
That's the world I grew up in. And the reality is, Jeremy, you provoked this row by questioning my ability to do this job. Why didn't you pick up the phone and talk to me about my background and my understanding of these issues?
So that excuses your grossly offensive language.
War back in and I thought your attack on me was grossly offensive. Why did you question my ability to do this when for 5 years, as leader of the GLC, I was responsible for civil defence in this city?
So that's an excuse for then actually using offensive language, which not only I found offensive, but actually undermines the fantastic work both the Labour Party, charity sector and others have been doing in trying to address stigma around mental health. And I'm sorry, that's not unexcusable.
Just listening to you trading blows across the studio here, how on earth can you work with each other and come up with a coherent defence policy, Mr Livingstone?
Well, the simple reality is we've all got our preconceived views about whether Trident's good, whether we should have more, or whether we should put that money instead into rebuilding our Army and our Navy and our Air Force. Well, we've got to come to this committee with an open mind and look at the facts. And that's My background and training as a cancer research technician was to look for the truth, and that's what we've got to do over these next few months. And whether or not Jeremy end up going out and have a nice pint in the pub or not is irrelevant to all of that. We've got to decide, is £20 billion spent on this a good use of money? Yeah.
OK, let me look at the big picture now with Lord Richards here, who's been listening to that rather interesting spat. You accused David Cameron of, in your words, lacking the balls to take military action in Syria and to prevent the rise of ISIS. Do you think he's found the balls to do it now?
I was actually misquoted. A headline in a newspaper is not actually what I said.
Let's call it gumption.
You're better that. You're well used to that. You know, as a journalist, I believe that David Cameron has understood what's required for a long time. The problem has been convincing his own party and indeed clearly recently those in the Labour Party. So I think there is a clear intent. He's now got to demonstrate the strategy. I think France and what happened on Friday has hugely reinforced the case. But as I said this morning in another interview, both the Foreign Affairs Committee and David Cameron are right. It needs to be placed in a wider, grand strategic context. But he is right too in that we need to get on with it.
Well, so should he bypass Parliament then, David Cameron?
Well, it's an interesting debate, and I'm not a politician. I was slightly surprised when it was decided that you had to go to Parliament before any decision to take military action, give or take. But that's a decision that's been taken, and I wouldn't query it. I mean, that's for politicians to decide.
Kevan Jones, before Paris happened, you said that Labour was right not to back military action in Syria. Have you changed your mind at all since those attacks?
The fact of the matter is the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party have failed to actually argue the case for military action and how it fits into a wider strategy.
But are you open to that argument now?
But he's got to make it, and he's failed to do that. And the problem isn't just the Labour Party, it's his own Tory backbenchers who are saying this. Military action in itself is not an end to this. It's got to be part of a larger, well-thought-out strategy, and he's failed to do that.
Well, Ken Livingstone, you've put it rather more bluntly than that. You've said after these Paris attacks that the endless interventions of Britain and America and France in Arab countries have come back to haunt us. But, I mean, France wasn't even involved in the Iraq war in 2003, which many people blame for this chaos at the moment.
But it has been involved in Libya and it has been involved in Syria. And the tragedy is Britain and America and the West are totally discredited because of Afghanistan and Iraq. We need to defeat ISIS. That means troops on the ground, but it's got to be a broader coalition. You've got to bring in Russia, you've got to bring in Iran. I think we should look wider to China and African countries like Nigeria who are suffering from Muslim extremism as well. And that broad coalition can defeat ISIS. I don't think the West can do it on its own, and certainly not just by bombing.
Ken Livingstone, Kevan Jones and Lord Richards, thank you very much for joining me.